Hello guys, today I will evaluate a movie called The Fault in Our Stars 2014. The movie starts with Hazel Grave, who has lung cancer, and Gus, a love, drama and sentimental movie. Please watch and enjoy. A young lady named Hazel Grace Lancaster is lying in the grass gazing up at the stars. She expresses that she accepts we're permitted to pick how to recount miserable stories, and that albeit one can gloss over it and say there's nothing that can't be fixed with a Peter Gabriel melody, it's not reality. Hazel experiences stage 4 thyroid malignant growth, who had testicular disease and is presently separated and lives with his folks, however is positive since he is alive. Franny believes Hazel should make companions, yet as Hazel says, the main thing more regrettable than gnawing it from disease is having a youngster that chomps it from malignant growth. One day during her outing to the gathering, Hazel finds Augustus Waters. During the gathering, Gus gazes at Hazel. Patrick first approaches Gus's companion Isaac, who had a cancer in his eye and presently wears a glass eye, however he is grateful due to his smoking hot sweetheart Monica. At the point when Gus is approached, he says that he has been going away from osteosarcoma subsequent to having half of his right leg removed. Patrick inquires as to whether he has any apprehensions, and Gus expresses that he fears blankness. Hazel shoots this somewhere around, saying that in the long run, everything and everybody will be proceeded to neglect, and assuming that alarms him, he ought to overlook it. After the gathering, Hazel sits tight for her mother, and Gus emerges to talk with her. They see Isaac and Monica making out and grabbing one another, then, at that point, rehashing consistently to each other. Gus clears up for Hazel that this is their approach to saying they will continuously cherish one another. He asks Hazel her name and tells her she's lovely. He then, at that point, places a cigarette in his mouth, which disturbs Hazel since it has demolished her impression of him. Gus makes sense of that he never lights or smokes the cigarettes he puts between his teeth to not give the killing thing any power. He welcomes Hazel to watch a film. While Gus carelessly drives to his home, he gets some information about her disease story. She lets him know that she was analyzed when she was 13 and went through all the necessary treatment, yet it wasn't working. Her lungs started to load up with water and she was treated in the ICU. Then one day, the prescription she was given started to function admirably, which was viewed as phenomenal. Hazel and Gus show up at his home and meet his folks. He carries Hazel to the cellar and requests that she recount to him her genuine story, not her disease story. She professes to be unexceptional, yet that's what he dismisses. He gives her a duplicate of his #1 book in view of his #1 computer game Counterinsurgents. Hazel, consequently, suggests her #1 book An Imperial Affliction, which is about a young lady that has leukemia, yet she lets Gus know that it isn't really a disease story. While Gus carelessly Hazel trusts that Gus will get back to her, and following a couple of days, he texts her subsequent to completing An Imperial Affliction. He communicates shock that the book closes mid-sentence. Hazel reasons herself from supper to address Gus on the phone, yet they are interfered with by Isaac crying a tune verse behind the scenes. Gus welcomes Hazel over, where she figures out that Monica said a final farewell to Isaac before his activity, when his other eye will be taken out, in light of the fact that she can't deal with the results. Gus says Isaac is having a crazy episode, while Hazel says Isaac's reaction to the separation appears to be typical. Gus permits Isaac to take out his resentment on his B-ball prizes. While Isaac crushes them, Gus converses with Hazel about the closure of the book, and she lets him know that she has composed many letters to ask the book's writer, Peter Van Houten, inquiries regarding what occurred after the story, for example, the destiny of Anna's mom and her relationship with the Dutch tulip man, and Anna's pet hamster Sisyphus. One night during a phone discussion, Gus tells Hazel that he found Van Houten's collaborator and got a reaction from a message he kept in touch with Peter Van Houten. Van Houten said thanks to Gus for his and Hazel's advantage in the novel, and that he has no ongoing designs to compose any subsequent meetups to An Imperial Affliction. Hazel is surprised that it took that one email to get a reaction. She chooses to think of her own email back to Van Houten to pose her inquiries. A couple of days after the fact, Hazel gets her own reaction from Van Houten, who likewise says thanks to her for her advantage in the story, and even welcomes her to visit him in Amsterdam. Excited, Hazel tells her mom, and keeping in mind that she needs to satisfy her little girl, she realizes they wouldn't have the option to bear the cost of it. Hazel educates Gus concerning the greeting, and Gus proposes asking the genies a Make-A-Wish kind of association to give her this desire. Hazel expresses that she previously utilized her desire to go to Disney World. Gus is frustrated that she utilized her desire on a banality. Some time later, Gus appears at Hazel's home with orange tulip blossoms in a basketball shirt of Rick Smits, the Dutch basketball player, and afterward welcomes her on an outing to a recreation area, highlighting a Goliath skeleton jungle gym called Funky Bones. A copy of a craftsmanship by a Dutch craftsman. Gus jokes that he has brought all his heartfelt triumphs here, and for that reason he is a virgin. He even delineates this by attracting a circle the soil of virgins and a little circle inside of 18-year-old young men with one leg. As they have their outing, Gus tells her that he addressed the genies and persuaded them to concede him the wish of taking Hazel to Amsterdam. Hazel awakens around midnight experiencing difficulty breathing as liquid fills her lungs. Her folks rush her to the medical clinic, with Gus holding up outside, since he isn't permitted in family as it were. Hazel has the liquid depleted from her lungs, and she recuperates. After a gathering with the specialists, they establish that she is genuinely unsuitable to travel anyplace in her condition. Hazel then at that point has a flashback to when she was in the ICU as a kid with Franny telling her she can give up, and afterward wailing to Michael that she won't be a mother any longer. Feeling discouraged, Hazel doesn't answer calls and instant messages structure Gus. She sits before a swing in the terrace that her dad fabricated when she was a youngster. She calls Gus and communicates her misery. He comes over and they sit on the swing. He tells her that her staying away from him doesn't reduce his fondness toward her. She looks at herself to a projectile and that she will explode and obliterate everything afterward. Not having any desire to hurt Gus, Hazel concludes they should remain companions. Days after the fact, Van Houten's colleague Lidwig messages Hazel to expand the greeting again subsequent to discovering that they will travel Amsterdam in 7 days. Hazel calls her mom in, and she concedes that she needed to shock her along with her dad, yet they are to be sure going to Amsterdam. Hazel embraces Franny and afterward texts Gus. He answers, everything is coming up water. She then peers down at her lungs and advises them to hold their poo together for basically 7 days. Gus shows up in a limo to get Hazel and Franny, proclaiming he needs to go in style. On the plane, Gus becomes anxious as he's never flown on a plane, and he becomes energized once they take off. At the point when Hazel gives Gus a kiss on the cheek, Franny thinks that they are on their most memorable day in Amsterdam. Hazel and Gus ride through a trench and go to a Dutch eatery, Orange. Hazel wears a decent blue dress given to her by Franny. Franny is dazzled by how attractive Gus searches in his smoking, and Gus is paralyzed by how lovely Hazel looks. At the cafe, they are invited as Mr. and Mrs. Waters, served Dom Perignon interestingly, and they appreciate it. They have their supper, and Gus gladly proclaims his affection to Hazel, which puts a major grin all over. The server drops by with more champagne, and he says the supper was undeniably paid for by Van Houten. The following day, Hazel and Gus go to meet Van Houten. They are welcomed at the entryway by Lidwig, who invites them inside. There is unopened fan mail all around the floor. Several tracks down, Van Houten in his nightgown, drinking scotch. They plunk down, so Van Houten can respond to their inquiries, however he rather arranges Lidwig to put on Swedish rap. In spite of the uproarious rap, Hazel begins to pose her inquiries, for example, the destiny of Anna's mom and the Dutch tulip man. However, Van Houten just answers with philosophical garbage. Gus inquires as to whether he is playing with them, and Van Houten offers an impolite remark about Gus's malignant growth. He just deteriorates by declining to respond to Hazel's inquiries and offending her and Gus's ailments. Hazel and Gus storm out. Van Houten asks her for what reason she harps on these inquiries, and Hazel simply advises him to go screw himself. Lidwig, shocked by Van Houten's way of behaving, offers to accompany Hazel and Gus to the Anne Frank house. Since there are no lifts, Hazel should stroll up every one of the steps and ascend the stepping stool, which overburdens her relaxing. They get up to the floor with a vocal recording of Anne Frank's journal. As Anne Frank's considerations and compositions are voiced about catching magnificence and being cheerful in troublesome conditions, Hazel and Gus share their most memorable kiss. The spectators, including Lidwig, commend them. They return to Gus's room and have intercourse. Interestingly, Hazel leaves him with a drawing of the enormous Virgin Circle and the circle of 18-year-old young men with one leg outside that large circle. On their last day in Amsterdam, Hazel and Gus eat with Franny prior to strolling alone together. They sit on a seat, and Gus tells Hazel that when she was in the ICU, he felt a torment in his hip and got a pet sweep. Hazel definitely understands everything that he will say to her. Gus says the output illuminated like a Christmas tree, and the malignant growth returned and spread through his body. Hazel puts her head on his shoulder and cries. Gus attempts to ease up the temperament by recommending they make out. Hazel, Gus, and Franny return to Indianapolis with Michael getting them. A couple of days after the fact, Hazel and Gus spend time with Isaac, who is presently totally visually impaired and lets them know that Monica hasn't addressed him since the separation. To encourage him, Hazel and Gus purchase eggs, and they go to Monica's home and allowed Isaac to pelt her vehicle with eggs. Gus calls Hazel around midnight to request that she come to the service station to help him. She heads around there to find him sitting in his vehicle, shrouded in his own bodily fluid and regurgitation, with a contamination in his midsection from the G-tube, needing to buy another bunch of cigarettes since he can't track down his old pack. Hazel calls a rescue vehicle, in spite of Gus's requests not to. The emergency vehicle shows up and takes Gus to the clinic. Gus goes through greater therapy for the disease until the specialists choose to take him off the chemo. Hazel is currently the one being rejected in his clinic chamber since she is no relative. He currently requires a wheelchair to get around. Hazel takes him to the recreation area with the Funky Bones reproduction for a cookout. He communicates his longing to affect the world before he kicks the bucket and his need to carry on with a remarkable life. Hazel disapproves of it and lets him know that he doesn't have to do all that since she and his folks love him and that this ought to be sufficient. He says he's grieved and they drink champagne. Gus calls Hazel one more night to welcome her to the literal heart of Jesus for a get-together and to bring a tribute that he requested that Hazel compose for him. She begins to leave yet is come by her folks who are setting up supper. Hazel contends with them that she will be gone and that they will be separated from everyone else subsequent to hearing her mom say she won't be a mother any longer after Hazel kicks the bucket. Franny is surprised Hazel recalls that and makes sense of that she presently realizes she was off base and will continuously be Hazel's mom, regardless of whether she bites the dust. Both her folks say they will love constantly her regardless and that Franny is taking classes to turn into a social laborer and help families that go through a comparable cycle that they are going through. Hazel is glad to hear this and doesn't need to stress over her folks, assuming she passes on. Her folks will be satisfied even after she is no more. Hazel joins Gus and Isaac at the congregation for what is a pre-funeral that Gus needs to observe since he needs to go to his own memorial service. Isaac gets going a tribute with a hint of humor, yet says that assuming he at any point is given robot eyes, he would deny them since he would rather not see a world without Gus. Hazel goes up and begins to discuss her romantic tale with Gus prior to changing to arithmetic and that there are endless numbers somewhere in the range of 0 and 1, that there are innumerable boundless qualities and that she is grateful for their vastness. The two of them say I love you to one another one final time. Gus bites the dust 8 days after the fact. The Lancasters get a call around midnight to hear the news. Hazel's folks stroll into her room and without a word, she realizes what's up and starts to cry. She reviews while going through treatment and the medical caretaker requested that she rate her aggravation on a scale from 1 to 10. Hazel said 9 and the medical caretaker said she was a warrior for calling a 10 a 9. She says that she was not being bold at that point, yet saving her 10 for this kind of difficult event. Memorial service is held for Gus. Hazel and her folks go, and as the minister speaks, Hazel is amazed to see Van Houten there. Hazel is called up to talk, rectifies the evangelist that she is Gus's sweetheart, puts a bunch of cigarettes between the blossoms on his casket, and gives another commendation that she sees as more fitting for people in general at the burial service. After the memorial service, Hazel chooses to commute home alone, and Van Houten enters her vehicle. There, she discovers that he and Gus stayed in contact before his demise, and Gus told Van Houten that he could make up for himself by visiting Hazel and addressing her inquiries. He uncovers that Anna depended on Van Houten's 8-year-old little girl who passed on from leukemia. Before she irately sends him out of her vehicle, Van Houten gives Hazel a letter, which she folds up and discards. She drives away and sees him drink from his cup in the vehicle's mirror. Hazel's father goes to comfort her following Gus's demise. Afterward, Isaac approaches visit. He tells Hazel that Gus truly cherished her and talked constantly about her to the place where it got irritating. He inquires as to whether she read the letter from Van Houten, which turned out to be composed by Gus. She understands that the folded letter she discarded in the vehicle is from Gus and not from Peter Van Houten. The letter is a tribute for Hazel composed by Gus. We hear Gus's voice understanding it, saying that he slipped into Hazel's room in the ICU while she rested, holding her hand and his opinion on them together. He communicates his profound respect for her excellence and character and adds that individuals can pick who hurt them. Gus enjoyed his decision and he trusted Hazel loved hers. He closes the letter with "Okay, Hazel Grace." The film closes with Hazel actually lying in the grass and gazing toward the stars, answering okay.